My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sankaran, Guru Piranyo, fellow Jnanis. Today I'm going to continue again part two of births and rebirths of Swamiji's teachings. And what we have here is we covered the last time, on births and rebirths. I spoke about the material universe and how the universe came about, and when we mean by birth and death, what does birth and death means in the context of our material body. So we have two important bodies, which is gross body, which is material. There's also the subtle body, and then Swamiji also talks about the causal body. But I'm just going to focus today on the gross body and the subtle body. In the last satsang, I spoke about the gross body, and we saw that the gross body is nothing but actually the emergence of our material universe from the Big Bang or the primordial atom, and we have all the formation of all the particles of the universe, the building blocks, and we see that from there emerged, the basic building blocks that formed our body. And through the formation of the body, we experience this four-dimensional universe with time and space and so on. And we see that there is a birth, for a while we sustain, and then the body dissolves. And in the sustenance period, we see that we assemble all the materials from this material universe to form our body, sustain the body, and over time, through the process of aging, our body cannot synthesize or metabolize or some of the key elements, and you see that certain parts of our body slowly starts disintegrating, and then eventually we age, certain hormones starts depleting, and we see that our hair turns white, our muscle starts withering, and slowly, one by one, organs start shutting down, and eventually the body passes on. So so we see that there is birth, there's sustenance, and then there's death. But what's really interesting is that the basic building blocks remain the same. The forms may change, but we see that the building blocks remain. So we see the cycle, births and rebirths from the building blocks. There are many universes and suns, and one of those is our solar systems and the planets. And we go through this process, from birth right up to death. By the way, not just humans go through this. Every animal, every biological beings go through this. Whether it's plants or bacteria or viruses or much more complex beings go through this process. Some have a shorter time span, others have a longer lifespan, and so on. But ultimately, we see that the matter, the particles, form into bodies, sentient bodies. Over time, it's sustained, and ultimately it dissolves. So the question we want to ask is that, birth and death in this material universe, what is it? And you see that in the fundamental level is just a transformation from one form to the other. So again, when we really analyze what the birth and the death is, it's actually transformation of the same particles, in different forms. So one can say that, if God is the particle, we see that God in different forms. So if we extrapolate that logic and argument, we see that at least our matter body are all God in different forms, and so whether it's a plant or whether it's an insect or whether it's a virus or whether it's much more complex beings. So one gets a much more deeper perspective of this body, and we don't get too overly concerned when the body goes through this transition if we are illumined by this. So we see that, so the question that we want to ask, and this is where most of the scriptures starts asking this question. If you read the Upanishads, they talk about, so what is it, what is born and what dies? And when we look at the form level, yes, we see there's a birth and there's sustenance for a while and death, and we say, okay, this is this birth-death cycle. But actually, when we look at much more at the micro level, more detail, we see that it's just a form that is changing. The substance still stays the same. So at the substance level, actually, it's still at the samadhi state. It's still in the original state. Only thing is that it combines and forms different, more higher order structures or physical entities. So this is at the form level. This is at the material level. Now let's take more deeper, right? So we have seen that gross body, but we also have seen, now we're going to come down to the subtle body. Yes, we see that this at the gross level, we have that molecules and all the hydrogen, nitrogen that forms this earth, and we've got this form. But deep within, if you see very carefully, in all the forms, you see at the background of this slide, you see that the molecules, the hydrogen and all, are formed on the basis of that formless, right? And that formless gives rise to the Big Bang and all the things that thereafter from the Big Bang forms the Earth. At the core of the Earth, you see that the energy is also in the background is still the formless Irul, or the formless, dimensionless, timeless substratum. And when we see very clearly also that as we saw the forms earlier, from the mother carrying the child right up to the infant, right up to someone aging, we see that form. But at the depth of the form, we see that the form is taking place, at the background, you see that the formless, that Irul, that timeless, dimensionless, formless, what we call the self, which is essentially powering everything. As we see this form, we see that at the background of the form, we see that Irul actually is, lying quietly, the potential force. So we see that, while form is taking place, it's taking place on a formless substratum, right? And we see this actually, if you look at some of the examples of this, we actually are that formless, right? And that formless gives rise to form, right? So that formless is that original state that we cannot remember. When we say cannot remember, means we have no cognition of this material universe, which means that we are in that formless state. So we have no understanding of the formed universe because we are in that formless state. We don't have that color or time. We are in that state. So that background is who we are in that original state. As that comes into contact with this material universe, we see that the form takes place, but it takes place, within that the substratum that supports that is actually that formless. So we see that in all of us, while we have this material body form, what's powering that is actually that we see that background that is dark, that is formless, dimensionless. That is that subtle body that we don't see it or cognize it with our material apparatus, our eyes, ears, nose, because that is only to detect that material universe that we have. But we get into that when our material apparatus go quiet or goes to sleep, we go back to that Irul state, which is the formless, dimensionless, and timeless state, that deep sleep state that all of us go through for 6 to 8 hours. We experience this also in the deep meditation state. We experience this also when our body is dissolved in the state of death. So we see this explanation of this formless, dimensionless, the timeless state of our existence. This is what great saints and sages call the self, or the supreme consciousness. That's that state that we were in. This is that state that we are in this material world, but within that state, that formless dimension is there. So we see that, so let's go a little bit more deeper to the properties of the self, because we really want to understand. So we know that at the material level, the body, what we call birth and death, is just a transformation. What about the subtle level? Well, at the subtle level, if you see very clearly, let's now define what the subtle level is and what the self is. What are the characteristics of that self? Because once we understand that, then we'll have a very good understanding of what this birth death is. So we see that in that first state, we see that that subtle state or the body is not part of the body and the mind. It's different from the body and the mind. You see, the body, you say, hey, I can observe the body, right? The body changes, but I'm not the body. The same thing with the mind. Some days I feel good, some days, and I can tell, hey, my mind is not happy today, or mind is this, and mind. So what you're doing is you're observing something that is happening that's giving you an emotional state that is related to your physical experiences and so on. So we know that this subtle state or the Irul state or the self state is not part of the body. It is apart from the body. So it is not part of the body, it's an apart from the body, which means that it's not the property of the body and the mind. And some philosophers say that, because I have a body, that means I am the thinker. Without the body, the thinker is not there. So here, the Upanishads say that, and Mahan's teachings say that this formless, dimensionless, timeless state that we have is not part of the body and mind. It is apart from the body and the mind. So there's a separation between the subtle body and the gross body. It's not a property of the body and the mind. So that means it's very different. The second part is that, as we see in this chart, it pervades and illumines the body. That means it enables the body, it powers the body. Without this Irul or that which gives you the consciousness of this is the body, this is the body that I am, driving or occupying or using or experiencing. So without that consciousness, the body is unable to power itself. So we see that it pervades and illumines that body and that mind. So it enables the body to experience, and so on. The third aspect is that it is not limited to the body. It can exist beyond it. And this is very important because in the deep sleep, the body is completely absent. Your material identity is completely absent, but you can say, I slept very well. I didn't know anything. I didn't experience anything. So that in itself tells us that it is not limited. I don't need the body and the mind to experience this. And the experience is that the absence of the body, that in itself is an experience. So here, again, the thought experiment that great saints and sages, and if you think very carefully, hey, in the deep sleep, in awakening state, I experience the body and experience everything. But in the deep sleep state, all the material experiences in the material world and my material identity disappears. Yet I know that the absence and the presence of the two. So we can clearly see that the third axiom tells us that it is not limited to the body and the mind. It exists beyond the body and the mind. So there is a transcendental component of that subtle body. As I mentioned, it is important for the functioning of the body. So without that, the body does not function. The body cannot cognize, cannot, experience, cannot learn, and so on. And finally, we see that without the mind and the body, it is there, but you cannot experience it. So when we mean experience, we cannot experience that, hey, this material, we are part of this material. We cannot experience that material body and make that distinction. So what we see here is that the subtle body or the self is different from that body and the mind. It is important for the body and the mind. It's not a property of the body and the mind. It can function beyond the body and the mind, but the body depends on it. And more importantly, without the body and the mind, you cannot experience this material world. So for that formless and dimensionless and timeless, for it to experience form, time, and so on, the body is very important. So somewhat like, somebody told me this, Guru, this is really complex. And I said, look, I've just traveled to the UK and experienced the cold weather, and I can give you a description of it, right? You may have an understanding of what cold weather is. But for you to experience that cold weather, I mean, that means a part of the material universe, right? You need to have a body to be able to experience. I may be able to tell you, look, what this is what 2 degrees Celsius is, or the wind and so on. You may have an idea of it, but until you experience it with your body, you would not understand this material universe very well. So we see that, we have both components, which is the formless, dimensionless, timeless, and we also have the formed, time, and that which dimensions. And we see that to understand life, you need both, right? And that's why in some of the Upanishads, he says that we have both the Shava, which is the corpse, the body, and the Shiva, which is the self, or that which is, the supreme consciousness. You need both to experience the dynamics between both the subtle body and the gross body. Now, coming back to this whole notion of birth and death, I just showed you the case where in the material body itself, we see that birth and death is actually a transition of the form, the building blocks of nature, which forms. So form changes. Is that what we mean by birth and death? Or at a more subtle level, we see that it's just a transformation of this basic building blocks. But when we come to the subtle body, we see that the subtle body is formless, dimensionless, and timeless. Timeless means that, there is no time. Can you imagine living in a period where there is no time, or living in a dimension there is no time? Just imagine, is there a moment that we become transcendental to time? The answer is yes. In deep meditation, in deep sleep, time is not there. We don't worry about birth, and we don't worry about death, or we don't even worry about, eating and doing everything else. It just is absolute silence. So we see that, the subtle body neither has birth nor death, because by definition, it's timeless, right? So we see that even at the subtle body level, birth and death is just an illusion. So, and this beautifully brings us back, to some other examples I can show you in terms of electricity, right? I mean, electricity is running in our homes, and we plug in our different apparatus, it has different functions. Similarly, our body, whether we are a leaf or a grass, or, an insect or a amoeba or a virus or a bacteria or any other creatures, as long as it's plugged into that, eternal, the subtle, the self, we see that it powers based on the frequency of that material body, it functions according to it. The grass will behave in the way it is supposed to do, same thing with the flowers and so on. In that same way, all of us are plugged into this, you can call it the universal electricity or this self. And because of our biology, because of the DNA, because of our ancestries, all of us have subjective or individual experiences. See, though we are powered by the same electricity, we see that, the way we behave, the way we do things are very, very different. So we have that infinite possibilities and infinite, varieties in this nature that is plugged into the same electricity or the same supreme consciousness. So we see that while the electricity is the same, the apparatus that are plugged in have different functions. A 20-watt bulb will only, shine 20 watts of energy. The same thing with 40 watts, 100 watts. A fan behaves differently. Combustion engine behaves differently, but the electricity is still the same, right? The same thing we see with light. We have, we have different types of light, but in its original form, we see that, light is one color. And the same thing with water. Water in its essence is H2O, but as it travels through the river, it carries different colors and different textures and so on as it goes through its journey. And we see that, while the color may be very different, while the texture may be very different, the essence of the water is H2O. When it goes through the evaporation process, the air molecules, the water molecules are the same. So we see that within ourselves, we have both the gross side and the subtle side. Even at the gross level, the meaning of birth and death, if you go deeper, they actually are in that samadhi state. And similarly, if you see in the case of the subtle body, the subtle body is not touched by time. It's in the samadhi states. And what do we mean by birth and death and the transcendentality? And this is a beautiful chart that the picture that shows how someone who has died laments that, I have died, and is missing something. And here a wise great saint says that which does not die is the Atman. Atman is that self or the supreme consciousness, or the various names are given this. He says you are the Atman which is all pervasive. What does that mean by all pervasive? That Irul state, that is the background state that gives, that's that changeless substratum that enables all the changes that takes place on it. So here, this notion of birth and death, as you go deeper, you see that as you have deeper understanding, you have a better understanding of the changes that is taking place in the body, which is the natural transformation that takes place. Initially our mothers eat the food, to assemble the body. Then the body comes, it becomes independent, and the body starts, assembling food on its own. And then there comes a stage where there's a disassembling that takes place, and eventually the entire body is disassembled. So if you take from a very scientific perspective, even the body, the birth and death is kind of an evolution. The same thing we see with the Atma that powers it. It is not touched by time. It's formless and dimension. So if we understood this phenomena of birth and death, we see that we would not be afraid of birth, death, disease, poverty, and our mind becomes much more stronger. The mind then reinforces, hey, whatever come, I am not touched by this birth, death, and disease cycle, birth, death cycle. So this is what Mahan tries to teach here in terms of the birth, death cycle. The next class, I'll speak a little bit more in detail with other models to explain this concept of birth, death, and the infinite possibilities and the potentialities of us that is much more far superior than the material identity that we have. Sandosham.